Joining us for today's class. Oh, and we are being recorded, which means that I can now officially begin. So thanks again to everyone for joining us for last week's class. Thank you to those who sent in your Dublin core work. It was great to see what you guys were doing. And if some of you want to end up working with those same items today for today's exercise, when we hit that point, I think that you'll find that really instructive, although I've also prepared some exercises in the class for later. So today we're going to be talking about the structure of the PBCore metadata standard. Once again, this presentation was funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities. We are partnering with Northeast Document Conservation Center. We're very appreciative of their help with hosting. And PBCore was originally funded by the Corporation of Public Broadcasting and is currently under control of GBH. So what is PBCore? I'm going to just start by talking about some of the key functions of what PBCore is, because I think it can actually be used in a number of ways. So PBCore primarily is a guideline for cataloging or describing audiovisual content as a content standard. It provides structure and terminology and ways for thinking about and standardizing the descriptive content and the technical content that comprises the necessary metadata around audiovisual materials. It can be used as a model for building custom databases and applications. It can be used as a guideline for identifying a set of vocabularies for fields describing audiovisual assets. It can be used as a data model for a configurable collection management system, such as Omeka or Collective Access, or anything else that's currently in use in the library and archive space. It can be used as an import or export mechanism between applications. That's the way that we use it here very often at GBH. It can be used as a guideline simply for creating inventory spreadsheets to help people get a sense of what they have in their collections. Does anybody have any questions about kind of these functions or how PBCore can be used before I move on to sort of describing the structure of PBCore? I'm going to give it about a minute. All right, I'm not seeing any questions at this stage, but remember that if you have any questions throughout the course of the presentation, please feel free to just drop them in the chat and we'll try and answer as best we can. All right, so let's start by asking, how do you build a PBCore record? We saw with Dublin Core yesterday that Dublin Core records are described, sort of designed to be very simple, and that can be both a bit of a blessing and a curse when you're talking about complex audiovisual assets. And for your example, some of you sent in some really cool complex assets that I think will provide great use cases for sort of the complexities of PBCore, and we'll get to that later in the presentation. So there are three basic types of PBCore records, as opposed to kind of the one kind of Dublin Core record that can be used to describe anything. When you're talking about a PBCore record, you could be talking about a description document, an instantiation document, or a collection document. There are also a number of different kinds of elements of PBCore. These are more or less the building blocks of a PBCore record. So there's asset elements, there are instantiation elements, and then there are attributes that describe those elements. And I'll talk about all of those as we go through the presentation today. So first, I'm going to focus on the different types of PBCore records. This is just kind of a diagram that I think will help describe the different ways that a PBCore record can be built. So a description document is kind of the main way that you'll see PBCore used. It's probably got the broadest functionality. And this is designed to be able to describe a piece of content, such as, for example, an episode of a television show, a feature film, a home movie, that has certain descriptive information that can be applied to it. It has creators, it has contributors, it has a title, it has subjects, it has all of the kind of content information that a user would that would be the reason that a user would want to access this material. And then within that description document, you'll have descriptions of the specific instantiations of that asset. So say we're talking about the film Star Wars. You're going to have the concept of the film Star Wars. That is, it stars Mark Hamill and Harrison Ford, and it has, it has a certain plot, it has a certain director, it has certain themes. And that's true regardless of where you see that movie Star Wars, whether you go to a drive-in theater and watch it, whether you watch it at home on your DVD, whether you're looking at, kind of the original film print that was created, like when the first draft of the picture was put together. Conceptually speaking, the description will always be more or less the same. Now, that's not always necessarily true, and we can talk more about some of those nuances later. But generally speaking, you can have one piece of content that's available on many different medium, and the content information will always be the same, but the technical information that describes the different media through which the content is available is going to be distinct to each mechanism by which you experience that media. So within that description document, you'll contain descriptions of the specific, instantiations of that content. And that's where the technical information regarding each of those instantiations will live. So think of this as, you go to your public library and you want to rent a copy of Star Wars. You'd look for Star Wars, and first you'd find a record that describes the reason that you wanted to see Star Wars, which is that you like lightsabers and Carrie Fisher, and you want to see some of that on your screen. And then the library would present to you different ways that you could access that information. It might say, we have a VHS tape. And you say, well, I don't have a VHS player. And then it might say, well, I have we have a DVD. And you'd say, all right, I have a DVD player, rent me out the DVD. And the information about the VHS and the DVD are those instantiations that would be contained in the one description document, which is basically the library saying, yes, we have something that is conceptually Star Wars. Now in PBCore, you can either have a description document that contains these multiple instantiations, or you can just have an instantiation document that contains only the technical information about a piece of material. And you might say, well, why do I want that? Why do I want to just know the technical information? Isn't it important for me to know about the content? And the answer might be that, say that you're working in an archive where you don't necessarily know about the content. A couple of you noted last time when you were trying to apply Dublin Core description to your audiovisual materials, that if you're just looking at a VHS or at a cassette tape, it might be really difficult to know what the content actually is. So it may be that it's useful to you when you're trying to conduct inventory of your holdings to simply craft instantiation documents that have the technical information about your materials, and leave worrying about the description information until you actually have that description information to be able to apply. There are also applications that can create instantiation documents. Media info is one that we'll talk about a little bit later in the course. That's an application that can run through a whole bunch of digital files and create PBCore instantiation documents that just describe the technical metadata about those files. And because it's just an application, it doesn't necessarily know anything about the actual content of those files. You can't run, more and more you can run an application and it will tell you maybe there's a dog in this file, but it doesn't have the complex interpretation knowledge available to say, this is the plot, these are the themes, these are the actors that are involved, or these are the narrators, these are the subjects, etc. An application such as that can only tell you technical information. And so you might want it to give you an instantiation document that just provides the technical information about the files. You'll notice in my diagram here that there's also two kind of sub-building blocks of an instantiation document. These are essence tracks. The way that so an essence track can't stand alone. You wouldn't have an essence track document in and of itself. But the reason that we kind of might want to break an instantiation document down into further subsections is because if you think about a video file, that video file, as we talked about a little bit last week when we were talking about codecs and wrappers, is actually composed of several other media tracks that are all put together in order to be displayed on your screen. So if you're watching a QuickTime file, what you're probably actually watching is not just one piece of video material, but you're watching a video track and probably two audio tracks and maybe a subtitle track, all of which have been wrapped together in a QuickTime wrapper so that your media player can present them to you, and all of them can be kind of played back at the same time together. These essence track building blocks are designed to be able to capture the specific technical metadata that regards, the audio track, the video track, the subtitle track of what actually goes into your instantiation. This is also actually applicable even in the realm of physical media. For those of you who work with film, you might have a 35mm film that consists actually of one reel that's the actual 35mm film that you see with your eyes, and another reel that's the magnetic track of audio that's supposed to play alongside it to give the audio experience. And in this case, both the 35mm video track or film track and the magnetic track that plays along with it would be essence tracks of one instantiation because they're intended to be played together. But you would have, one of those things is a reel of 35mm film. One of those is a reel of magnetic audio. And those things have different technical characteristics that you'd still want to describe using different elements of the essence track. Finally, the last thing, kind of main structure of a PBCore document is something called a collection document. This terminology can be a little confusing when we're working within a library and archive space because we're used to thinking about collections, right? And we describe the collections and we provide context for things and we present them to the world. That's really not what a collection document in PBCore is intended to do. A collection document in PBCore is not really supposed to provide context about the materials contained in that collection. It's really just a way to collect a whole bunch of PBCore documents together and say, I want to send all this off somewhere. I want to serialize it in a way that a computer will understand it. So, for example, when we're receiving a big collection, a big group of materials at the American Archive of Public Broadcasting from another organization that's using PBCore, and instead of sending us 500 individual description documents to tell us about the media that's coming our way, they're like, we just want to send one description document or one large collection document that will include all those description documents. It's just easier for us to deal with one piece of XML than 500 pieces of XML. Then we might receive that as a collection document. I see there's a question in the chat asking whether it's like a zip file. That's a great question. It's not like a zip file exactly in that you can't sort of, expand it and get unless you have an XML parser that would pull those description documents out. It doesn't, decrease the size and it doesn't pop back into being 500 documents. It's basically more kind of like a container file that says, all right, I'm going to put all those 500 individual description documents in one piece of XML together. So you just have one long document to look at instead of 500 short documents. And that's really it. I'm not going to talk too much about collection documents today because frankly, they're not very much used. Most people don't really care whether they're sending, they might as well just zip 500 documents and have us unzip 500 description documents rather than serializing them all in a collection document. But sometimes it can be useful for, presenting something on a website or doing something else where your computer will find it easier to parse one document than a whole bunch of smaller documents. And a collection document can contain many description documents, which can contain many instantiation documents, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And that's kind of the nested structure of PBCore. Oh, and so here's, my example again. I got so into describing it, I actually forgot to click through the slides that had my examples. Here is Star Wars: A New Hope. And here's a bunch of different ways that you might experience Star Wars: A New Hope. And then this is the way that document might actually look if you were reading it in kind of a human readable format. So, in your description document, you'd have information like the asset date, released in 1977, the identifier that you would give it, the title being Star Wars: A New Hope, and the description. And then you might have one instantiation that's a physical instantiation that has barcode 123431, say that's a VHS or a DVD. And then you would have another instantiation, and that instantiation is a digital file. And so your identifier for it might be the file name. Say that you digitized a copy of it, and now you have a copy saying Star Wars: New Hope dub on your computer. That's a whole different instantiation than the original media that you digitized it from. And this is what that actually looks like when you're looking at it in XML. PBCore was kind of designed with XML in mind. As I mentioned at the beginning, it's certainly not the only way to use PBCore, but to understand why many of PBCore's functions were kind of designed like they are, thinking about it in terms of XML and the way that things are written and structured in XML is often kind of the best way to make sense of it. So in this XML document, you can see that here's the asset date, the element PBCore asset date, PBCore identifier, title, etc. And then you have a container element called PBCore instantiation. And within that PBCore instantiation container element is where you'd put the instantiation specific information, like what the barcode is, the date that instantiation was distributed, what kind of instantiation is, and what its location is, where you can actually find it. Here's an example of XML specifically for an instantiation document. And here's an example of some of the more specific breakdowns that you might get within an essence track. So, you see within the essence track type video, you're going to have information like, is it NTSC or PAL? That's a piece of technical information that really only applies to video, as we talked about last week when we were talking about specific properties of media. You're going to want to look at the frame rate. That's also something that's specific to a video track, because audio doesn't have frames in the same way. A subtitle track doesn't have frames in the same way. You're going to look at the frame size, the aspect ratio, things like that. And then for the audio essence track, you're going to have information that's specific to that audio digital material, like the sampling rate, which is something that really only applies to audio and not to video. So that's why PBCore kind of has these essence track options, is to break up that file and provide specific information that only applies to one portion of it. And then for your collection document, if you wanted to create individual documents for every specific piece of Star Wars media that you had on your shelf, and then just put them all together in one document, that's what you use the collection document for. So before I move on and start talking about the actual elements within PBCore, I just want to pause and ask if anybody has questions about the structure of a PBCore record. I'll give it about a minute and see if anybody wants me to go back to any of the points that I've kind of already talked about with these specific 3 ways that you can build a PBCore record. All right, I don't see any questions for right now, so I'm going to move on. But if any other questions come up now or at the end of the presentation, I am happy to take them or go back and discuss them. So I mentioned before and last week the asset elements that go into PBCore. You remember the 15 elements that go into Dublin Core, and PBCore has a few more elements than that, both on the asset and on the instantiation levels. The asset level elements are the elements that kind of go onto that description document level. They're designed to describe the intellectual content of a record. And the instantiation level elements are designed to describe the technical information about the record. Excuse me. So you can see that in this list of elements, there are 3 elements that are in red. That's PBCore identifier, PBCore title, and PBCore description. The reason that I've kind of highlighted these in a different color on this slide is because these are the only 3 elements that are required to make a valid PBCore record. PBCore more or less states that there's no point in describing anything unless you have a way to distinguish it from other things. That's having a PBCore identifier. You have a title or something to call it, and you have at least some kind of description, even if that description is, we don't really know what this is. But you want to be able to say something about it. Otherwise, why are you creating this record? I'm not going to walk through the definitions of all these elements, but I do want to stop here again and give everyone the opportunity to ask any questions that you may have about definitions of these specific elements before we move on. Some of these will probably be familiar from last week with Dublin Core, such as title, description, creator, and contributor. These are things that were taken directly from Dublin Core. And just kind of applied to PBCore. They're useful building blocks of terminology. There are other things that the people who created PBCore, who again were mostly public broadcasting people, thought were relevant specifically to the kind of media that they were describing, which are things like audience level and audience rating. These are things that you have to think about in the television space that might not necessarily be applicable to a scholarly article. I see there's a question about whether there's a mapping from PBCore to Dublin Core. There is actually. It's available on the PBCore website, and I can show you where to find that when I jump over to the website in a couple minutes. Is PBCore instantiation the link to an instantiation record? That's right. So you'll note that I put a little asterisk next to PBCore instantiation here. There are elements, a number of elements that are what we call container elements. And in XML, which is a nested standard, you use a container element to describe, you don't put any data in the container element itself. You use that to nest together 2 elements that apply to each other, or more elements that apply to each other. So PBCore instantiation is a large container element that contains a whole bunch of other elements that are significant in relation to each other and need to be kept distinct from other elements that are that apply to a different instantiation. To kind of illustrate this concept, I think creator and contributor are kind of useful small building blocks that work the same way. So if you're talking about a creator, let's go back to our Star Wars example and say we want to say that George Lucas was the director of the film. So for PBCore creator, I'd say that the creator was George Lucas and the creator role was director. And the reason those things need to be nested together is because if I just have an element that says PBCore creator, George Lucas, and creator role, director, without nesting these together, and then I have another creator that's PBCore creator, Mark Hamill, and PBCore role, actor, there's no way for me to tell whether, when I'm looking at that record, whether George Lucas is the actor and Mark Hamill is the director or vice versa. I need those elements nested together so I know that the concept of George Lucas and the concept of director apply to each other. And say that George Lucas played another role in the production as well. In this case, he was the writer. I would then maybe want to repeat that element and say, all right, creator George Lucas, creator role, director. But then also I would have another whole kind of elemental building block of PBCore creator that said creator George Lucas and creator role, scriptwriter. And then I would know that those things applied together. Would John Williams, the soundtrack composer, get the creator role? That's another great question. And that's something that we'll talk about a little more when we discuss controlled vocabularies next week. But in general, who gets the creator role and who gets the contributor role really depends on what kind of context you're working in and where your focus is. So a choreographer might be really important and might be considered the creator role if you're working in a dance archive. But if you're working in, a television archive and your focus is not as like a focus of dance research, then maybe they wouldn't get the creator role, maybe they get the contributor role. And that's really something that can kind of be defined based on your institution. If there aren't any other questions about specific PBCore asset elements, I'm going to move on to instantiation elements. So these are the different PBCore instantiation elements. Just go back to this slide again. I'm gonna, this is another example. PBCore contributor contains the sub-elements contributor and contributor role. And you can see in our XML example, someone here has put the note that there's no data directly in the PBCore contributor element. It just contains the sub-elements contributor and contributor role. All right, so these are the PBCore instantiation elements. These are all contained within the actual asset level element, PBCore instantiation. So if you're looking at an XML record, you'd see the element would be PBCore instantiation. And then within that PBCore instantiation, you'd have the elements that actually describe that instantiation. So again, I've highlighted the two required elements, instantiation identifier and instantiation location, here in red. Again, these are all the other elements are nice to have in PBCore. If you have that information and you want to document it, that's really useful. But you don't have to collect any of that information. What PBCore says is that as long as you have, again, a way to distinguish this instantiation from other instantiations, that's some kind of identifier, and you have a way to describe where that thing is, because a PBCore instantiation is a thing that exists in the world. It's a way that someone can access a piece of content. It is a DVD, it is a media file, it is a VHS, it is a reel of film. If it doesn't exist in the world in a way that somebody can access it, then it's not an instantiation, it doesn't exist, says PBCore. So in order to kind of assert that it does exist and that someone can access something that way, location is a required element. If you're talking about something that's not necessarily physical, like a digital file, instantiation location might be an address on a file server, for example, or it might be the location of the hard drive where that file is stored. But either way, it has to be some pointer to a place where you can access that instantiation. And then there needs to be an identifier. And then everything else is, again, useful information to have, but not required to assert the existence of a PBCore instantiation. So again, I'm going to pause here and ask if people have any questions about any of these specific instantiation elements, what the terminology is, what they may mean or refer to. You'll see that I kind of did the same thing with PBCore or instantiation essence track as I did with PBCore instantiation on the previous slide, because this is another big container element and it contains a whole bunch of other technical information regarding those specific essence tracks like we talked about before. PBCore instantiation also has rights sub-elements. these are repeated on actually both the instantiation level and on the description document level, because sometimes an instantiation might have different rights applied to it than the actual kind of conceptual thing above. So you might have a VHS tape that was donated to a library, that particular tape or item has a different rights relationship than the actual content from which it was derived. So PBCore gives you the option to describe rights at the instantiation level. It gives you the option to describe relationships at the instantiation level. This may seem repetitive, but it's sort of in line with the strategy of making sure that there's a place to put most information that you may have about an item if and when you need it. Does rights embedded refer to DRM info? That's a great question, but no, actually it doesn't. So the rights embedded is actually an opportunity to take metadata from another standard that may be kind of a more specific rights related standard, or another way that it's described in XML, and drop it into a PBCore record without kind of breaking the record. So you'll see also, this is a good example to talk about both rights embedded and PBCore extension. Both of these are ways within PBCore and places where PBCore says it's okay to take XML from a different standard and drop it into PBCore, and PBCore will kind of say, okay, you can use this different standard because it's better at describing that specific information than PBCore is. So PBCore is a very focused standard. The steering committee last time we did a big update pretty much determined that we wanted to make sure the scope of the standard was to focus on what we did best, which is we are one of the few standards that focuses on describing audiovisual materials. Most of the people working on the standard are not necessarily rights or legal experts. There are other standards existing that describe rights related to archival materials. And so if people wanted to go into that and use those standards that are more thorough and mix and match them with PBCore, they can do that. Similarly, if people use different standards, such as premise to describe preservation activities, they might want to incorporate that into a PBCore record. They could use PBCore extension with either extension wrap, which says I'm just taking an element from a different standard and putting it into PBCore, or extension embedded, which says I am just taking a chunk of XML from a different standard and embedding that right into PBCore. And then people can do that within their PBCore record and still take advantage of PBCore's different elements. I'm not seeing any other questions regarding the instantiation elements right now. Remember, we can always go back to these if people have questions. So I also mentioned that both, where would you put the description of the physical media in the extension wrap? So most of PBCore is designed to give you specific ways to put the description of the physical media without having to wrap that in a different standard. So, PBCore instantiation has dimensions. It has a instantiation physical, which is sort of a description of the format. It has media type. It has colors and tracks and channel configurations. And all of those things that we think cover pretty well most of what you might want to say about the physical media. But if there are others, there's other information about the physical media that's not covered in PBCore's instantiation elements. Either you would take an element from a different standard and you would say, either I'm going to describe what that element is, and I'm going to describe what the value is. I'm going to describe the authority that I used to add that extension. Or if it's something that you're not taking from a different standard, but it's something that's important to your institution specifically, you could put that in an instantiation annotation and simply say, I'm adding a note to this document that says, for example, we found a Post-it note taped to the top of this media that says that this doesn't work. And that's something that you might want to put in an annotation. I mentioned that you're going to need identifiers on both the asset and the instantiation level. This might seem redundant because, what if you have one thing and you have one identifier for the thing? But again, it's kind of intended to distinguish conceptually things that are at the content level and things that are at the item level. So an example of a PBCore identifier might be something like an APB asset ID, which is something that we tag all the content with that comes into our system. It might be a PBS NOLA code, which is something that PBS applies to every program that they create. It might be an IDER ID for those of you who are familiar with IDER, which is kind of a universal identification system for media content. This is an ID that will apply to the content, regardless of what form it takes or how you access it. If you're talking about an instantiation identifier, that's probably going to be something like the barcode or the file name or the MD5, the checksum that kind of validates the bits and bytes of that content. You might not always have a PBCore identifier that applies globally to the content. It might be that in some cases, when you're creating PBCore records, you have to use the instantiation identifier as the PBCore identifier. That's fine. There's no rule that says these things have to be separate, but conceptually speaking, that's the idea behind requiring both of them. So again, here's the example of an instantiation document that contains, this is the most basic level instantiation document. It contains an identifier and a location. It says that we have something that has this barcode and we have it here at GBH, and that's it. That's all the document, strictly speaking, needs to say. So the last kind of building block of a PBCore record, and as far as we're talking about the ways to actually contain information, are attributes. And in XML, attributes are ways to modify the information that's contained in an element. So for example, here are all the attributes that can be applied to the title element. A title, such as Star Wars, can have a type, like a series title, an episode title, or a project title. Is Star Wars a series title or is it a film title? That kind of depends on when and where it was titled, and you probably want to, maybe define how you're using that title if you're trying to catalog Star Wars. A title can have an element can have a source. This might be something that you might want to use if you're using a controlled vocabulary. Or if you've gotten the information about what the title is from the front of the box or from IMDb or something else. All elements in PBCore have the option to declare a source, a reference, a version, and an annotation. The source attribute provides the name of the authority used to declare the value of the element. This is, again, especially useful for controlled vocabularies, but may also be useful if you want to say that you got that information from IMDb. The reference attribute is if you have a URI that goes to that. This, again, for controlled vocabularies, a lot of controlled vocabularies provide URIs that will link to the controlled vocabulary and the definitions that it provides. It provides you the option to declare a version if there are different versions of that vocabulary or different versions of the source that you're using to declare that information. And an annotation, which allows you to include narrative information that's supposed to clarify the nature of the data used. So again, if you're declaring the title of something is Star Wars, you might want to add as an annotation that you're using the original title before, because the version that you have of this film is before that title was amended to Star Wars: A New Hope. Finally, start time, end time, and time annotation are things that are applicable, or attributes that are applicable to all descriptive elements in PBCore. And the reason for that is because a lot of media content is segmented. Think about a news program or a magazine program that has different sections. A half-hour program might include an interview and a local news section, and maybe a featurette on someone who's grown some beautiful local pumpkins. And if you want to just have descriptive information that applies only to a portion of that media, then you could use the start time, end time, and time annotation to say, well, yes, George Lucas is interviewed in this program, but he's only interviewed starting at 2 minutes in, and that interview ends at 6 minutes in. And so we'd put in the start time, end time, and time annotation if you really wanted to kind of time bound the descriptive information that you were applying to that content. So here's an example of where it gets a little bit tricky when you're trying to structure a record in PBCore. So say I have a Star Wars trilogy box set, contains a VHS tape for Return of the Jedi, Empire Strikes Back, and Star Wars: A New Hope. And I wanted to create a record for this material. There are a couple different ways I could do that. Most straightforward would be I could create a description document for each of these films. I would just put the asset information, the plot of the films and the actors featured in the films and the date that the films were released and so forth on the description document level. And then on the instantiation level, I'd put information about each of these, specific VHS tapes, how long they were, what their runtime was, what kind of, these are VHS tapes, and the information would all be broadly similar, but not identical. Each of these films is a different duration and so forth. And I would have 3 records, and that would be that. But say I worked at a library in which we only rented out this box set altogether as a trilogy. We didn't rent out these individual VHS tapes. And I wanted one record that contained information about this entire box set. A different way that I could structure this record would be I could use something called PBCore part, which is an element that takes a description document and subdivides it into smaller parts of that description document that contain all of the same description level elements that are included in a description document record. So then I could use, within one description document, I could break it up into parts and say part 1 of this asset is Star Wars: A New Hope, and that has an instantiation that's this VHS tape. Part 2 is this Empire Strikes Back, and I would describe that and then have an instantiation. And part 3 is Return of the Jedi, and then so on and so forth. And then I would have one record that was broken into parts. Each part was describing one of these VHS tapes. Someone sent in a great example last week of another place that this might be really useful. This functionality to break a record up into parts might be really useful, which is a compilation DVD. That DVD consisted of 3 films about great American, women's swing bands of the 1940s. And they were all contained on one DVD. And there was specific information about, the different directors of those films, each of which only applied to one of those 3 films on the compilation DVD. So if I were describing that compilation DVD, I might want to have one description document that said, here's the compilation, here's what its title is, here's when it was released, and so forth. And then in my PBCore part, I would say, all right, and the title of the first film on that DVD is so-and-so, and it was directed by so-and-so. And I'd put that information within a part because that's part of the overall record. However, for this box set, I might also have yet another way to describe it. I might say, I want to talk about Star Wars overall as a trilogy. And so I would say this is a full series. I just want to describe the series, and I would describe the series in one asset. But that series has 3 instantiations, or 3 VHS tapes, each of which is the same instantiation. It's an instantiation for the series, Star Wars, but that instantiation has 3 parts. And part 1 is this VHS tape that's 120 minutes long, and part 2 is 118 minutes long, and part 3 is 124 minutes long. And that is yet another equally valid way to describe this DVD or this VHS set in PBCore. So this gives you kind of an example of both the complexity and the flexibility of PBCore, which is really designed to let you structure a record in the way that's most useful for your institution. But also, there's not necessarily a right or a wrong way to do things. And we'll come back to sort of this complexity of structuring a complex audiovisual asset in a couple of classes when we're sort of looking more at the tools that can be used to create PBCore records. For now, I want to jump to the exercise, which I'm sorry, I know I ran a little over on time for my presentation today, so we're not going to have as much time for the exercise as I hoped. But what I want us to do is I'm going to walk through using the simple PBCore form that I created to catalog an example item. And then I'd like you guys to take a couple minutes to try and catalog one of the example items available in the class folder in the PBCore form. Again, we're not going to have a ton of time to do this today. So once again, I encourage you, if you want to complete this work at home, email me your work. And then we're going to return to this next week when we start talking about controlled vocabularies, which give a little bit more control about how and finesse in how we actually use PBCore to catalog items. So for right now, I'm going to stop sharing this presentation. And while I pull up the exercise, if anybody has questions about any of the things I've talked about so far, please feel free to throw them in the chat. So does everyone have access to the class folder and have a copy of the exercise form and the sample exercises that are available there? Thank you for dropping that link, Kim. It's very helpful. All right, so I have the class form up. Can everyone see me sharing that form? Perfect. Thank you so much. So I am currently cataloging a tape called Egypt's Golden Empire, which I'm actually, you know what, instead I brought this one and I'm holding it up and I'm realizing that you probably can only see me quite small when I'm walking through this exercise. So I will walk through one of the same exercises that I dropped into the class. A moment. So if everybody can look at example 1, Betacam screener. I'm just going to walk through how we're cataloging this. So this is a tape that I have on site at GBH. All the information that I have about it is what I can see here on the front of this case. So looking at this PBCore form, here's all the assets and elements, or all the elements that are available to me within PBCore. And you'll see that I've blocked out some things that are container elements. No data goes here. These things are designed to sort of contain element information about that goes together, like we talked about with creator and contributor. So the information that I have available to me here is I know that this is a Betacam tape because it says Betacam SP or Betacam STP tape specifically. It says that sort of along the top of the sticker. So for my instantiation physical, I'm going to put in the value field Betacam SP. I know that this is both a Nova tape and that the title of that Nova is Nova number 110. That the title of it is First Signs of Washoe. So first I'm going to put PBCore title Nova, but Nova just describes the series. So I'm also going to put attribute title type and value series to indicate that this title is a series title. Now, if I wanted to, I could then add another title field and duplicate this element. So I could say, all right, in addition to that, I'm going to say another PBCore title is First Signs of Washoe. And the attribute title type value is episode. I have a barcode number. It says barcode number 64970. And so I'm going to add in my identifier. This is the only identifier I have. I don't, well, I have an identifier that's an episode number as well, but really properly that's sort of within the title. So I'm going to put barcode 64970 in both my PBCore identifier and my instantiation identifier fields because that's the only identifier I have for this right now. And in that, I'm going to add an attribute that's source. And I'm going to add the value that this is a barcode identifier. And I'm going to copy this information. And add it to instantiation identifier. What other information do I have here? Well, not that much, but I know that I have a contact that says Michael E. Mushlitz. I don't really have, I'm looking up at my elements. I don't necessarily know that I have a great way to put this information that says contact Michael E. Mushlitz. So again, this goes back to that question about where to put physical description of within PBCore. I don't have an element that describes this, so I'm going to add this as an annotation. And I'm going to add an annotation that says case includes the information contact Michael E. Mushlitz. And then I might transcribe some of that other information that doesn't kind of fit tidily into any of my fields here. And that's about it. That's about everything that I can glean from this tape. But I'm not quite done because, as we know, within PBCore, in order to have a valid PBCore record, if I'm going to have both an asset and instantiation level record, I need to have a title. I have that. An identifier. I have that. And a description. I don't have that yet. So to make that valid, I'm going to add the description, Nova episode. That's really, this doesn't provide a lot more information than what I had previously, but it does make it a valid PBCore record. And I also need to add, in order to make a valid instantiation, I need to add a location. I found this tape here, so I'm going to add instantiation location, GBH. And that's all that I can do right now, but I have, cataloged this information. I apologize for this sort of graying out, which wasn't intended, by the way. I have cataloged this record in PBCore as best as I am able right now. Could I use the source attribute for my annotation? You mean the case including the information, contact, point calling, mushlets? Yeah, absolutely. So I could use an attribute source, and I could say Betacam case, or information found on case. Again, we're running out of time, so I'm going to let you guys go ahead and tackle this. You can pick any of the exercises, or you can try and tackle one of your own. Again, you're not expected to be able to fill out all of the elements here. Just try and do as many as you can in the next, let's say, 7 minutes, and we'll come back together at 1:25 and talk a little bit about any questions that have come up over the course of the exercise and what we're going to be doing next week. Oh, and sorry, one more thing. I'm also going to put in the chat if you guys want a reference for where to go to add attributes. And again, this isn't necessary if you just want to fill out this PBCore form at the element level right now. And if you just want to pick one element rather than trying to duplicate things in your worksheet, that's fine. This is just a starter exercise, and we're going to be returning to this form over the course of the class. But for anyone who does want to refer to PBCore's elements and attributes, all the elements and their definitions can be found here. And it will tell you what if you click on an element, it will tell you what attributes are applicable to that element. So for example, going into PBCore title, you can see that there's a number of attributes that are applicable to PBCore title. Whereas, for example, if I go to PBCore instantiation and I go to something like instantiation physical, the only attributes that are applicable to that are source, ref, version, and annotation. So again,
Becca, are you sharing your screen?
Oh, sorry,
We're not seeing the browser screen.
No, you're right. I meant to send that to the chat actually, rather than the browser.
Okay. Thought maybe.
I sent it in direct message, so I apologize about that. Can everyone see these links in the chat now? Fantastic. Sorry about that. So you can, if you want to look at that as you're doing this exercise, please feel free. If you don't want to start doing that work yet, again, we'll be returning to elements and attributes and more of these specific definitions and terminologies next week. I see there's a question about an example hard drive of miscellaneous containing born digital files. Um, Absolutely, that would be a great example piece to use. Um, those born digital files, you'd probably want to catalog them individually, but then you could serialize them as part of a collection. But you could also, if you wanted to catalog the hard drive as a whole, you could use the PBCore part element like we discussed with the VHS tapes or with the compilation DVD. Um, and describe the hard drive and then break it out into parts. And each of those parts would describe one of those born digital files. And you'll see on the screen share, if you wanted to use a PBCore part, oh, did I include it on the sheet? I did not. If I wanted to do a PBCore part, we're so short on time. I'm not going to show an example record that's divided into parts right now, but I promise I will return to that next week as an example of the kind of thing that you discussed. And yeah, we can also cover this conversation in email. All right, and it's 1:25, so we're going to come back together, but everyone please feel free to keep working on these exercises and email me examples if you are interested in doing so. Again, I apologize for how short a time we had to work on this exercise today, but if people have questions or found things challenging about working in PBCore or had questions about how to describe some of the things that you saw in the exercises, please share them with the class. All right, I'm not seeing any. Oh, when writing out information written on cases, do you write them verbatim? That's a really good question. And again, this is something that kind of depends on your context. if the information written on cases is all that you have when you're cataloging that media, then often, yes, it would be a good idea to write that out verbatim, because any information that you have about that could be a clue about the content of the container. But if you're trying to catalog in a hurry, if you have limited time, if you already have a good sense of what the content of your media is, and you know, for example, from the context that you're in, that some of that information is simply no longer relevant. Like, for example, in the context that I was, my example, when I was showing you that case, working at GBH, I know that the person whose information was on the front of that case no longer works here and hasn't worked here for some time. So this information is probably no longer as relevant to capture, because I'm working within this institutional context and already have the a fair amount of information about NOVA and the various different NOVA episodes and what this particular content might be used for. Then if I found this in an archive and I didn't have any context for what this information was or why it would be useful, but I knew that it might be a clue for researching the media or providing more information about it later on. I'm not seeing too many other questions, but again, please feel free to hit me up with them in future classes or over the course of the next week. And I'm happy to correspond with people one-on-one about any questions that have come up when working on these exercises. Next week, we're going to be talking about controlled vocabularies. So we're going to be returning once again to these exercises. We're going to be going over some more of the terminology that's used in PBCore. I will bring some example records for parts, since that's something that people had, seemed interested in. And we're going to have a little bit more time, hopefully, to do these exercises again. And then we're going to be working in small groups to kind of compare how one person might catalog versus how another person might catalog, and how, the kind of standards and guidelines of controlled vocabularies can help to kind of ensure that records are mutually understandable. So again, optional homework: complete a PBCore cataloging form and email it to me for review. Send me a case study from your organization for final class or on the final class of metadata modeling. I know I'll already be chatting with a few of you about that this week. And I'll be contacting some more of you who've indicated that you might be interested in sharing a case study. And we will go from there. Thank you all again for joining us for this class. Looking forward to seeing you guys next week and to seeing what to do with the PBCore form.